The snow had been falling since dawn, a relentless tide of white swallowing Pine Hollow inch by inch. By evening, the small roads leading into town were impassable, buried beneath drifts so deep it seemed they would never melt. I watched it from the window of my family's cabin, an old relic nestled at the edge of the forest, far from the twinkling lights of the main square. I had come alone, determined to escape the season's shallow pleasantries, smiling faces and empty words, and instead immerse myself in something real. Pine Hollow, with its silence and solitude, seemed ideal. This was not my first winter here. My parents had brought me as a child, though even then, the old cabin had always felt slightly apart from the rest of the town. Now, standing at the window, I felt its isolation more acutely. The cabin itself was sturdy, built by hands long since gone, but the forest pressed in close, branches heavy and sagging, dark knots of pine swaying gently. Beyond them, the world was hidden, save for a pale moon that seemed to linger just a little too long in the sky. I stoked the fire, its embers casting faint flickers across the wooden walls, and settled into my chair. It wasn't long before the sound came. Faint at first, just a distant thud. I paused, listening. The wind? No, something deeper. Rhythmic. Like footsteps. I shook my head, dismissing it. My mind had a habit of playing tricks in such stillness. And yet, minutes later, the sound came again. Closer. I stood, careful not to make a sound myself, and turned off the single lamp. Darkness enveloped the room save for the dim glow of the fire. Moving toward the window, I glanced out again. The snow gleamed in the moonlight, unmarked, pristine. I exhaled, my breath fogging the glass. But there, at the edge of the trees, I saw it. A figure. It stood motionless, half obscured by shadow, but its outline was unmistakable, tall, gaunt, with arms that hung too long at its sides. I blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, it was gone. For a moment, I stood frozen. A deer, I thought. A trick of the light. Yet unease settled into my chest like ice. I pulled the heavy curtains shut and stepped back, my pulse loud in my ears. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, curled in the armchair before the fire. When I woke, it was to silence. The kind of silence so deep it rings in your ears. The fire had burned low, its light feeble, and for a moment, I felt as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. Then, the thud came again. This time, I knew it wasn't the wind. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and moved slowly toward the door. The sound was closer now, just outside, in the snow. It was deliberate, heavy, and accompanied by something else, a faint dragging. Fingers trembling, I reached for the door's lock and checked it twice. Don't open it, I told myself. Whatever it is, don't open it. Then I heard it, a long, guttural scrape against the wood of the door, as though nails or claws had been dragged across it. I staggered back, my mind racing. A bear? An animal, surely. But deep down, I already knew better. The cabin felt smaller now. Its walls, though thick, could not keep it out. I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and stood motionless, listening. Then, as abruptly as it began, the noise stopped. I waited, holding my breath, until the silence stretched so long it became unbearable. Slowly, I stepped toward the window and pulled back the curtain just an inch. The snow outside was no longer untouched. There, leading away from the door, was a trail of footprints, large and grotesque, each pressed deep into the frost. They led back to the forest. I felt a cold sweat on my skin. The fire crackled faintly, but the room itself had become a prison. My thoughts spiraled, dark and wild. whatever had stood at my door was not an animal. It had waited, and it would come back. It was just before midnight when I finally set the last of the logs beside the fireplace. The crackling flames spat and hissed softly, throwing their restless glow onto the darkened wooden beams. The room around me was hushed, except for the occasional distant groan of the house itself, a sound I'd long dismissed as nothing more than the shifting weight of old timber. I told myself I wasn't listening for anything else. I told myself I hadn't looked over my shoulder more times than I could count that evening. Yet, my skin crawled with an instinctive unease I couldn't explain. It wasn't rational. Perhaps it was just the lonely silence of the cabin gnawing at me, or the maddening way the wind clawed at the window panes like fingernails. Outside, Pine Hollow lay still, blanketed by fresh snow. The forest beyond seemed vast and endless, its dark pines standing like sentinels under the brutal moonlight. I should have felt safer indoors. I didn't. The radio crackled softly on the table, spewing faint snatches of carols in between bursts of static. It had been my only company all evening, that and the wind. My family's cabin had no internet or cable, a deliberate choice my father had insisted years ago, meant to force you to appreciate nature. I could almost hear his voice now, booming and cheerful as he chopped wood or trudged through the snowbanks in his heavy boots. But I wasn't hearing my father's voice. The scratching came again, from outside this time. Somewhere near the porch. I froze. At first, I tried to dismiss it, raccoons, perhaps, or a stray deer nosing through the snow. I strained to listen, though my heartbeat thumped in my ears, drowning out the quiet. And then I heard it, a slow, deliberate dragging sound. It scraped against the wooden steps of the porch, the kind of sound made by something heavy and unwieldy being pulled across the ground. I swallowed hard, throat dry. Every instinct screamed at me not to move. I stared at the door, the firelight flickering across its old brass latch, as if expecting it to rattle violently. My mind began to race. I thought of the larder knife in the kitchen drawer. I thought of the old hunting rifle my father had stored upstairs in the wardrobe. Slowly, I stood and crept toward the nearest window, stepping as lightly as possible on the creaking floorboards. A bitter draft leaked through the old wooden frame as I peered outside. At first, I saw nothing but the snowy whiteness of the clearing. The shadows of the forest seemed darker now, more menacing, like ink bleeding into the edges of the world. Then I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. A shape. It stood at the edge of the tree-line, half hidden in the darkness. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs gangly and distorted, like a nightmare version of a man. Its body appeared draped in something coarse and matted, and though I couldn't see its face clearly, I swore I saw something gleam, two faint red glimmers, staring back at me. It was watching. The dragging sound returned, louder this time. I flinched back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. Somewhere on the porch, the thing was moving again. And then came the knock. Not a polite knock, nor a panicked one. It was slow and deliberate. Thud. 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 I took a step back, unable to tear my gaze from the door. The knocking stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy that I could hear my own breathing, ragged and quick. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run upstairs, to hide, to do something. Then, I heard the voice. It came from just beyond the door, so low I almost couldn't understand it. Words spoken through what sounded like a throat full of gravel. Let me in. The voice stretched the words out, each one dripping with malice, like something savoring the very sound of speech. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't human. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth crackled violently, sending a plume of sparks into the room. the shadows leaped across the walls like writhing creatures. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to move toward the kitchen, toward the knife drawer. The sound of scratching returned, now at the window. Whatever was outside wasn't at the door anymore. It was moving around the cabin, circling like a predator. I didn't dare look out the window again. I stumbled into the kitchen, wrenching open the nearest drawer and grabbing the first thing my hand found, the larder knife. It felt small and pitiful in my hand, but it was something. From outside, there was a sudden thud, so loud that it rattled the cabin's frame. I spun around, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The sound had come from the roof. Whatever it was climbing. The thudding sound above me echoed like a hammer striking hollow wood. I stood frozen, clutching the larder knife so tightly I thought it might snap. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I tried to tell myself that it was something explainable, snow falling in heavy clumps, branches snapping under frost. But I knew better. The weight of it was wrong. Too deliberate. And then it began to move. Above me, slow and dreadful, the sound of footsteps crossed the roof. Thud, thud, thud. Each step scraped faintly against the snow, as though claws or hooves dragged across the shingles. Whatever it was, it paced back and forth with dreadful patience, as though waiting. My eyes darted to the ceiling. Tiny tremors of dust sifted down from the old wooden beams, floating like ash in the wavering glow of the fire. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, directly above me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. The quiet stretched on, unbearable and suffocating. And then something slammed against the roof. Bang! I let out an involuntary gasp as the noise reverberated through the cabin, shaking the windows and rattling my bones. My mind was wild, desperate for answers. How could this thing be on the roof? How could it knock with such power, yet remain unseen? I backed toward the center of the room, knife still gripped in my shaking hand. The radio hissed to life. I whipped my head toward it, heart pounding. The carols were gone now, replaced by pure static, broken occasionally by faint, disjointed whispers. It was as though someone, or something, was trying to speak through it, but their voice was drowned in a sea of white noise. "Let me in." The whispers came again, clearer this time. My knees nearly buckled. The front door rattled violently. Bang! 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 I screamed. The door heaved against its frame, as though a great weight was being hurled against it. Dust shook from the hinges. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the edge of the hearth. Then the knocking stopped. A low growl, a sound so deep it seemed to come from beneath the earth, rose up from the other side of the door. It vibrated through the wood, crawling up my spine, rooting me to the spot. I could feel it there, just inches away, separated only by splinters and nails. And then came the scraping. A sound like nails, long, jagged nails, dragging down the length of the door. It was taunting me. I felt tears sting my eyes. My breath shuddered, a mix of terror and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. Yet every sound, every movement, defied all logic. The scraping stopped abruptly, and the silence returned. I dared not move, afraid to disturb whatever fragile truce had fallen over the cabin. And then, slowly, horribly, the brass latch of the door began to move. Click! I dropped the knife. It fell with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo for an eternity. I scrambled back, my hands finding the edge of the coffee table. The latch rattled again, higher this time, as though unseen fingers, something too large to belong to a man, fumbled with it. And then it stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear only the low hum of the radio, still whispering incomprehensible words. And then a voice that was mine, spoke from it. "Why don't you let me in, Mark?" I staggered back, knocking the table over. The voice was distorted, twisted into something monstrous, but it was unmistakably my own. A sick imitation that mocked every syllable. My eyes darted to the window. The frost on the glass had grown thicker, spreading like a spider's web. And there, just beyond it, stood a figure. It loomed impossibly tall, its shoulders hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Even through the frost, I could see the faint glow of its eyes, red as burning coals. The thing stared in at me, unblinking, its breath steaming against the glass. And then it smiled. The grin stretched far too wide, splitting the shadows of its face to reveal jagged, blackened teeth. I screamed and stumbled backward, crashing into the sideboard. The radio shrieked with static, the fire blazed higher in the hearth, and then the window shattered. Glass exploded into the room with a shriek of wind and snow. I threw my arms up to shield my face, but the cold hit me like a fist. The cabin erupted into chaos, curtains whipping like frantic phantoms, the fire guttering, the hiss of embers spiraling into the dark. And through it all, I felt it, a presence entering the room. I dared to look up. There, in the broken window, a long arm slithered through, a clawed hand dragging itself inside, its skin pale and gray, mottled like something long dead. The thing was coming for me. And the voice, it spoke again, louder this time, echoing through the room like the scream of a blizzard. "Let me in." I did not know how I moved. My legs seemed to act on their own, dragging me across the floor in a desperate scramble to the far corner of the cabin. Splinters bit into my hands as I crawled away from the shattered window. The cold wind shrieked through the room, carrying with it the foul, metallic stench of something ancient, something dead. The clawed hand pulled itself farther inside, the grotesque fingers splaying out as though testing the air, testing me. Inch by inch, it slithered forward. My breath caught as I saw it, the bone-jointed knuckles, the way its pale skin stretched taut like parchment over jagged veins. The hand paused briefly as if savoring its entry into my space. Then another arm followed. The creature was climbing through. I felt panic crash over me in violent waves. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. My body was frozen, not from the cold, but from terror so pure I thought it might suffocate me. I watched, helpless, as a face emerged from the void, a head that scraped against the shattered window frame as it forced itself through. Its eyes, those terrible, burning eyes, fixed on me immediately. They narrowed with cruel intelligence, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. It grinned. The smile stretched impossibly wide, the lips splitting, dark blood dribbling between jagged, coal-black teeth. The grin seemed to fill the room, a grotesque parody of something human. The firelight flickered wildly, as if recoiling from the monster that now invaded my home. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a fire poker lying by the hearth, and staggered to my feet. My pulse thundered in my ears, but my grip on the poker was iron hard. The creature's shoulders now squeezed through the window, its torso contorting unnaturally to fit the frame. I heard the sickening crack of bones bending where they should not bend. "Stay back!" I screamed, though my voice sounded small, meaningless against the howl of the wind and the grinding noises of the thing's movements. The creature froze, tilting its grotesque head toward me. It blinked slowly, mockingly. It didn't stop. The poker felt heavy and useless in my hands, but I lunged forward and swung it with every ounce of strength I had. The metal struck the creature's arm with a hollow, wet crunch. For a moment, I thought I'd heard it, maybe it could be stopped. But the thing didn't flinch. Instead, it turned those smoldering eyes on me, its mouth curling back into a sneer that made my stomach twist. The poker slipped from my trembling fingers. And then it spoke. "Mark." My name came from its mouth like the groan of breaking timber, guttural and deep. The sound slithered through the air, curling around me like a physical thing, sapping the heat from my blood. I stumbled back. "No, no. Stay away." The creature's smile widened. It heaved its bulk into the room, the sound of its entry like wet flesh dragging over broken glass. Its full height was monstrous, far taller than any man, hunched though it was. Its arms dangled low, its clawed fingers twitching as though eager to seize me. I bolted. I don't remember making the decision to run, my feet simply obeyed. I turned and sprinted for the hallway, the walls narrowing around me as I fumbled my way toward the bedroom at the end. Behind me, I heard the creature move. The floor groaned under its weight, the sound of its claws clicking against the wood as it gave chase. "Let me in." The voice, it was closer now. Too close. I threw myself into the bedroom and slammed the door behind me. My hands shook so violently I struggled to turn the key in the lock. It finally clicked. I staggered back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Silence. For a few precious moments, there was nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I pressed my ear to the door. The hallway beyond was quiet. Had it gone? Could something like that vanish so suddenly? I dared to hope. Bang! The door shuddered violently in its frame. Dust sifted from the beams above, and the old hinges groaned under the pressure. Bang! I stumbled back, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The creature was on the other side. I could hear its labored breathing, the sick rasp of air dragging through its throat. "Let me in." The door creaked as the wood began to splinter. I grabbed the heavy chest of drawers by the wall and shoved it against the door with all my strength. The noise of its movement seemed deafening. The banging grew louder, angrier, the creature's claws now scraping furiously against the wood. I fell to the floor, my back pressed against the far wall. I squeezed my eyes shut and clutched my knees to my chest like a child. My mind raced, searching for answers, for some shred of logic. I remembered the stories. The old Christmas myths that spoke of something coming for the wicked, something ancient, older than the traditions of holly and firelight. The shadow of Christmas, they said. The Punisher. I had dismissed them as nothing more than old-world fables. But now, the scraping stopped. I opened my eyes slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The silence was worse than the noise. I couldn't hear it anymore. I couldn't feel it. And then, from just beyond the door, I heard the faintest sound. It was laughter, low, guttural, and echoing like it came from the depths of a frozen well. The creature was waiting. And I knew, deep down in some primal part of myself, that it would not stop. Not until it was inside. The laughter seeped through the splintered door like smoke, curling around the room, suffocating all warmth. It was a low, dragging sound, devoid of joy, an echo of something ancient, cruel, and patient. I stayed there on the floor, clutching my knees, my body convulsing with shivers that had nothing to do with the cold. "Think, Mark. Think." I forced myself upright, my movements slow and deliberate, as though any sudden noise might summon the creature's claws through the door. The chest of drawers still trembled slightly against the splintered wood, a fragile barrier that I knew wouldn't last much longer. I surveyed the room with frantic eyes, a narrow window, heavy curtains, the old four-poster bed looming in the shadows. Nothing useful. Nothing that could save me. Outside. The thought hit me like a slap. The window. If I could get it open, I could climb out and run far from this place, far from whatever had dragged itself out of the dark. My fingers fumbled at the frost-rimed latch, trembling violently. The wood was old, warped by years of damp, but I pushed and tugged until... a groan from behind me. I froze, every muscle locking in place. I turned slowly, my breath misting in the frozen air. The door, though splintered and shaking, was eerily still. But the sound hadn't come from the hallway. It had come from inside the room. The shadows shifted. It emerged from beneath the bed. The pale, clawed hand slid across the floor first, dragging the rest of its grotesque form behind it. Its body unfolded in broken, unnatural movements, elbows bending the wrong way, joints cracking like dry twigs. It crawled toward me, slow but deliberate, its grin widening as it moved into the sliver of moonlight cutting through the curtains. Its eyes, black pits of coal ringed with embers, seared into mine. It hadn't waited. I stumbled back, my heels catching on the uneven floorboards. The window was my only chance now. I turned and lunged at it, slamming my shoulder into the glass. The pane cracked, but didn't break. Behind me, the scraping grew louder, closer. I turned back just in time to see it rise to its full, impossible height. Its head brushed the ceiling. The creature's voice returned, deep and guttural, a mockery of a whisper. "Mark, you've been waiting for me." I screamed. I threw myself at the window again, this time with every ounce of strength I could muster. The glass shattered, an explosion of shards cascading out into the snow. The bitter cold hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I scrambled through the jagged frame, feeling the glass slice at my skin as I tumbled into the snowdrift below. I landed hard. The wind was knocked from my chest, but I staggered to my feet, gasping, dizzy, disoriented. My breath curled in thick plumes in the frozen air. I looked back up at the cabin. It stood still and dark, as if the monster within had never existed. But it was there. I could feel its gaze on me, those fiery eyes searing through the shadows. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my boots crunching through the snow, each step sending needles of pain through my limbs. The trees loomed ahead like sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sound of it followed me, the heavy scrape of claws against ice, the thud of its impossible footsteps. It didn't run, but it didn't need to. It was always behind me, closer than it should have been. I felt it. The cold grew heavier with every step, like the snow itself was dragging me down. "Help!" My voice was swallowed by the wind. There was nothing here, no roads, no people. Just the endless, frozen night. I pushed on, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. And then I saw it, a light in the distance. A small, flickering yellow glow. A house. A cabin. My salvation. I sprinted toward it, half blind with desperation, my limbs leaden and numb. The snow deepened around me, clawing at my ankles like hands trying to pull me under. I stumbled, fell, scrambled forward again. Behind me, the creature's voice slithered through the trees. "Almost home. Mark." I screamed again, my voice hoarse, raw. The light grew closer now, the shape of a small cabin cutting through the snowstorm. I reached the door and hammered on it with my fists. "Please. Please let me in." No answer. I turned the handle. It gave way. The door swung open into a dimly lit room, and I stumbled inside, slamming it behind me. Warmth. The fire crackled in the hearth, golden light spilling across wooden floors and walls. It was silent, save for the pop of burning logs and the wheeze of my own breathing. I sagged to the floor, my forehead pressed against the door, my entire body trembling violently. Safe. But then I noticed it. The fire was burning. The lights were on. And there, on the mantel above the hearth, hung a stocking. Red and frayed. Embroidered with my name. Mark. My blood ran cold. I turned back toward the door just as the wind howled outside and something heavy thudded against the wood. It had followed me. And now, I realized with icy certainty, there was nowhere left to run. The thud came again, heavy and deliberate, shaking the door on its rusted hinges. My breath hitched in my throat as I pressed my back against it, palms splayed against the worn wood as if my strength alone could keep the thing out. "Go away," I whispered hoarsely, though I knew how futile it was. Whatever had crawled out of the dark was not bound by doors, by walls, or locks. I knew that now. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, as if mocking my terror, and the stocking with my name embroidered on it swayed gently as though touched by a phantom breeze. My eyes locked onto it. Who had put it there? Who knew I'd be here? The thudding stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your mind race. For a moment, I dared to hope that it was over. Perhaps the creature had gone, receded back into whatever depths of nightmare it had come from. Slowly, shakily, I moved away from the door. My boots crunched faintly on the wooden floor, the sound deafening in the quiet. But then I heard it. The soft creak of footsteps overhead. I froze. Someone, or something, was upstairs. My gaze shot toward the ceiling. The light of the fire threw shadows that danced in time with the sound, long spindly shapes shifting above me, like they belonged to a body with too many limbs. And then came the laughter. That same slow, mirthless chuckle, but now closer, above me. The floorboards above strained as weight pressed down on them, moving toward the staircase. My heart slammed against my ribs as I backed away from the center of the room, my eyes darting toward the corners, the door, the window. Trapped. I could hear it descending the stairs. Each step was measured and deliberate, like it was savoring every moment. The old wood groaned beneath its weight. The fire crackled, but its warmth did nothing to drive back the frost creeping into my bones. My body screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. It reached the bottom step. I turned to face it. At first, I saw only the shadows spilling across the room, impossibly large, bending in unnatural ways. And then it emerged, stepping into the firelight. The creature no longer crawled as it had before. It stood, towering and twisted, its limbs stretching too far, its neck craning to an impossible angle. The grin split its face wide, blackened teeth against pale, ashen skin. Those coal-like eyes blazed as they locked onto mine. "Home for Christmas," it rasped, in that awful voice that seemed to crawl into my skull. I stumbled backward, my legs tangling under me, sending me sprawling onto the cold floor. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. It advanced slowly, its talon-like fingers brushing the air, reaching for me. I could smell it now, frostbitten earth, damp rot, the stench of something dead and buried long ago. "Why, me?" I choked out, my voice barely audible. It paused, looming over me, its shadow swallowing me whole. "Because you came back." Its words hit me like a physical blow. Back? My mind raced, clawing through memories I had buried for years. The house, the woods, the snow. I had been here before, long ago. A boy of 6, visiting distant relatives I barely remembered. But I did remember something. A night not unlike this one, when the cold seemed alive and the snow whispered through the trees. A dare to wander into the woods alone. I remembered hearing something then, a laugh in the darkness. A voice calling my name. I had run away that night, never looking back. I had forgotten it. Or buried it deep. But this place, this thing hadn't forgotten me. You belong to me now, it whispered, its breath cold and foul against my skin. No, I gasped. My hand shot out instinctively, fumbling for anything I could use to fight back. My fingers closed around a jagged shard of glass from the window. I swung upward with all the strength I had left. The shard struck its face, slicing through that grotesque grin. It shrieked, a sound that split the air and made the fire gutter in the hearth. I scrambled to my feet, my body numb and shaking. The creature staggered back, its claws clutching its bleeding face. I didn't hesitate. I ran. The cabin door burst open under my weight, and I stumbled into the snowstorm outside. The wind howled, the cold gnawed at my skin, but I ran, blind and desperate, through the dark trees. Behind me, I could hear it giving chase, the sound of its claws tearing through the ice, its inhuman shriek echoing through the forest. Mark! Mark! I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, until the world tilted and blurred around me. The snow seemed to rise up to swallow me whole, and I collapsed into its frigid embrace. I woke up to voices. Real voices. Human voices. Over here. We found him. Rough hands pulled me from the snow, hauling me up into the light of dawn. I blinked against it, my vision swimming. There were men in coats, rescuers, their faces etched with concern. "You're lucky we found you," one said. "You were nearly frozen to death." I looked back toward the trees. The cabin was gone. Nothing remained but the pristine snow and the silent, empty forest. Where is it?" I croaked. "What?" the man asked, frowning. "The cabin," I said. "The creature. It was here. It followed me." They exchanged looks of confusion and pity. "There's no cabin out here," one replied gently. "Hasn't been for years." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I stared at the tree line, my heart still pounding. In the quiet, I thought I heard it, faint and distant. That laughter. The rescuers led me away, their words a haze in my ears. But as I climbed into the truck, I glanced back one last time. Hanging from a low branch on a nearby tree was something red and frayed. A stocking, embroidered with my name. And there, in that cruel, silent forest, I knew the truth. You can run, but the past never forgets. The ghosts of Christmas will always find their way home.